My name is Stella Hayes, and I'm 36 years old. 9 days after my cybersecurity company hit the financial news with a $940 million valuation, my phone lit up with the first text from my mom in 10 months. Family dinner, no excuses. No question mark, no congratulations. Just a summons, the way you'd recall a defective product. 10 years ago, my parents destroyed my first startup and handed every client I had to my sister. They told the whole town I walked away. They let people believe I abandoned 40 clients with a form letter, and then they passed the potatoes and moved on. So when that text arrived, I didn't feel anger. I felt something colder and much more useful. Because I had been preparing for that dinner since November and none of them knew it. What I carried into my parents' dining room that night, and what I signed at that table in front of my whole family, none of them saw coming. Not my dad, not my mom, and especially not my sister. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet women finally say the things that were true all along, and families learn what those women were actually worth. If stories about standing up without screaming are your kind of stories, you're in the right place. Drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe, because this one starts with a loan and ends with a signature. The morning the valuation went public, my Denver office smelled like champagne at 9 in the morning. Somebody had taped a printout of the headline to the glass wall of the conference room. Kestrel Ridge Security, the company I built from a studio apartment next to the train tracks, was now worth more than every business in my hometown combined. My chief operating officer, Tom Okafor, knocked on my door with 2 coffees and a grin. "Reporters want the founder story," he said. "Scrappy girl from Ohio. They love that stuff." I smiled and said something appropriate. 9 days later, I was looking down at my phone, at the message sitting under my mother's name. Family dinner. No excuses. I want to be clear about something because it matters. My family never officially cut me off. That would have required them to admit something had happened. Instead, for 10 years, my mom sent Christmas cards signed "Love, Mom and Dad" in her perfect looping hand. Every birthday she called for exactly one polite conversation about weather and cholesterol, and hung up before anything true could occur. My dad never called at all. They didn't disown me. They just marked me down, the way my dad marked down water-damaged inventory at his office equipment company. Still on the shelf, no longer worth full price. Now the market had repriced me at $940 million, and here came my mother, right on schedule. Tom asked if I was okay. I told him I was great, and for once that was true, because the folder in my bottom drawer had been ready since November. The boxes had been read, the papers had been drafted. I had been waiting since November for my family to invite me over. All they needed was a reason to want me back at the table. To explain what was in those boxes, I have to take you back to Dayton, Ohio, in 2013, when I was 23, and stupid enough to think competence was the same thing as safety. I had just quit a good corporate job to start Lockstep IT security out of the garage of my rented duplex. My first client was a small law firm that got hit with ransomware on a Friday afternoon. I worked their case for 30 hours straight, documented every step, and charged them a fair price. They cried, they paid, and they told 2 other firms. That was my whole marketing plan: word of mouth and a paper trail. I logged everything back then. Every call, every change, every signature. In my business, documentation is the difference between an incident and a catastrophe. It's a habit that would eventually save my life, though not in any way I could have predicted. My family watched all this with a specific kind of attention. Our dinner table had never really been a dinner table, it was a boardroom with gravy. My dad, Frank Hayes, owned Hayes Office Systems, 3 locations, copiers and printers and service contracts, and every Sunday he ran the family like a quarterly review. My sister Meredith, 4 years older, did marketing for him and sat at his right hand. I was the line item that hadn't performed yet. Then Lockstep started growing, and I needed working capital to hire, and the bank turned me down flat. 23 years old, no business credit history, no collateral. I remember sitting in the parking lot of that bank doing math that wouldn't cooperate. And I remember my dad, that Sunday, smiling at me across the pot roast in a way he never had before. The offer was $150,000, and I want you to understand that I was not naive about it. My dad's lawyer drew up the papers, a convertible note, which means if the loan went unpaid, the debt could convert into ownership of my company. I read every page. Then I paid a lawyer of my own, a woman downtown who charged me $400 I barely had, to read it again. She flagged the conversion clause. She flagged the acceleration clause, the part that let the lender demand the whole balance early. Standard terms, she said, but with family, standard can get personal. So I negotiated. I got a buyback right added, the option to repay early and clear the note completely. I planned to use it fast. I took that loan with an exit already mapped, the way I'd enter any hostile network. My dad signed with his good pen and said, "Family money stays warm." My mom, Carol, refilled everyone's coffee and said how nice it was that the girls were finally back in the family business. I remember the sentence exactly because I corrected her. Lockstep wasn't the family business. It was mine. She smiled the way she smiled at church and said, "Of course. Honey. Of course." I noted it. I actually wrote it down that night in the notebook where I tracked open items, the way I'd log an anomaly I couldn't explain yet. Then I went to work. Over the next 2 years, I paid back $90,000 of that note, ahead of schedule, receipt by receipt. By the spring of 2016, I owed $60,000 and had a payoff date set for September. 4 more months. That's all I needed. Remember that number, because my dad certainly did. By 2015, Lockstep had 9 employees and about 40 clients on retainer, law firms and medical offices and a school district, the quiet backbone of a town like Dayton. I hired an office manager named Dale Mercer, a retired Air Force records clerk who alphabetized like it was a sacrament. Between the two of us, that office had a paper trail you could audit blindfolded. Meanwhile, my sister developed a hobby. Meredith started dropping by my office with her phone out, taking pictures for the Hayes Office System's social media pages. "Our family's tech arm," one caption said, over a photo of my server rack. I commented publicly, politely, that Lockstep was an independent company. She took it down and called me dramatic. At Sunday dinner, my dad ran my numbers out loud like an auditor, and I answered, because refusing would have cost more than complying. He'd brag about me at the golf course, I heard, but the phrasing always came back to me secondhand as, "our little security shop." Our. I filed that word in the notebook, too. Here's the thing people don't tell you about being the capable one in a family like mine. Your success doesn't buy you independence, it raises your appraisal value. Late that year, my dad found a new religion, a strip mall development out in Springfield that a golf buddy swore was a can't miss. "Safe as bricks," Dad said, carving the roast. He put in money I didn't know the size of yet, and my mom said how exciting it all was. And Meredith toasted him. I remember thinking, with the smugness of a 25-year-old who reads contracts, that at least it wasn't my problem. It's almost funny. In my line of work, the breach always starts somewhere you're not looking. The strip mall started eating him alive in early 2016. Permits stalled. Costs doubled. His partner turned out to be better at golf than construction. I learned most of this later, from bank filings and from my Aunt Ruth, but by that spring the losses were creeping toward $700,000, and my dad had quietly pledged the cash flow of Hayes Office Systems against it. At Sunday dinner, my mom began saying things like, "We're all tightening our belts," while serving the same roast on the same china. And then came the strangest move of all. In the middle of this bleeding, my dad set Meredith up with a brand new company, Boland Hayes Group, marketing and managed IT services, with her husband Doug's name on the paperwork beside hers. My sister, who could not tell a firewall from a space heater, was suddenly in the IT services business. I sat with that announcement for a week, and my gut told me the truth my brain didn't want. I couldn't prove anything. There was nothing to prove yet. But I know what staging looks like. In my work, attackers position their infrastructure before they ever touch you, so I acted. I called my dad's lawyer and moved my payoff date up. I gathered most of the remaining $60,000 and set the payoff for the first week of September. I also did one small thing that would cost me everything. In March, His office sent over a routine amendment, insurance paperwork for the note, and asked me to sign the signature page and send it back. I read the amendment. It was clean. I signed one single sheet of paper, my name in blue ink, and mailed it. One page. Remember that page. The letter arrived on July 11, 2016, 8 weeks before my scheduled payoff, by certified mail from my father's lawyer. The note holder was exercising the acceleration clause, full remaining balance, $60,000, due within 10 days. Failure to pay in full would trigger conversion of the note into a controlling equity stake in Lockstep IT Security. I read it 3 times standing at my mailbox. Then I called my dad. He answered on the 4th ring and talked to me the way you'd read minutes into a record. Market conditions. Fiduciary caution. Nothing personal, Stella. Paper is paper. I said, Dad, I have the money scheduled for September. You know this. We have a date. He said the note holder wasn't obligated to wait. And he was right. That's the part nobody warns you about. The borrower can do everything early and still lose, because the right to call the loan lives entirely on the other side of the table. I spent those 10 days like a war. I went back to my bank, then 2 more banks, then a credit union. Nobody bridges $60,000 for a 26-year-old in 10 days. I offered to pay the $60,000 plus a penalty, plus interest. Anything. His lawyer's reply came back as one short line I will never forget the shape of. The note holder elects conversion. Election. Like it was a civic duty. On day 10, I wired what I had as a good faith partial payment. It was returned the next morning. And on Monday, when I drove to my own office at 7 in the morning with a plan to keep fighting from my desk, my key spun uselessly in the lock. They had changed it over the weekend. Through the glass I could see Dale's desk already cleared. The shareholder meeting took 20 minutes. It was held in the conference room I had furnished, at the table I had bought at a liquidation sale, and my dad sat at the head of it holding 60% of my company. His lawyer read the resolutions. Item 1. Remove Stella Hayes as chief executive. Item 2. Appoint Meredith Hayes Boland as interim president. My sister, who had never worked a security incident in her life, did not look at me. She looked at a legal pad and underlined something, and I watched her do it, and I understood the whole architecture at once. The new agency, the timing, the 10 days. This hadn't been a loan going bad. This had been a harvest. I said very little because I had already learned there was nothing in that room left to win. When it ended, my dad came around the table and put his hand on my shoulder, gentle as a doctor delivering bad news, and said the sentence that has lived in my head for 10 years. It was never yours, sweetheart. You just ran it for the family. He meant it kindly. That's the part that still stops me. He believed it, the way other men believe in weather. At the far end of the table, my mother was gathering the meeting papers and tapping them into a neat, squared stack, and she said nothing at all. Nothing. I drove back to my rented duplex and sat on the floor between 14 boxes of my office things, and I inventoried them, box by box, because cataloging what remains is the only prayer I've ever been good at. 2 weeks later, the first email arrived from a client I had served for 3 years. It said, "You could have at least said goodbye in person instead of a form letter." I stared at the screen. What form letter? I asked that client to forward me what he'd received, and then I asked another, and another. What came back turned my stomach in a way the shareholder meeting hadn't. They were called client transition letters, printed on Lockstep letterhead, dated the week after the takeover. Each one announced that I, Stella Hayes, was voluntarily transferring all service agreements to Boland Hayes Group, and each one thanked the client for their trust, and each one was signed by me. Except I had never seen them before. I pulled up the signature and laid it next to my real one, and my skin went cold. It was mine. Exactly mine. The same slightly crowded S, the same tail on the Y. A perfect scan of a signature I had signed once, in blue ink, on one single sheet of paper that spring. The insurance amendment. The clean, boring, one-page amendment. They had lifted my signature page and stamped my name onto 40 goodbye letters. And every client in Dayton believed I had personally handed them over to my sister and walked away without a phone call. 40 letters, mailed the same week, in hand-addressed envelopes. And here's the detail I couldn't let go of, the one that kept me up at night for years. The handwriting on those envelopes was neat and looping and patient, the kind of handwriting that addresses 200 Christmas cards every December without smudging one. I knew that hand. I had seen it my whole life on lunch bags and permission slips. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, not even alone in my car. But I photographed every letter the clients sent me, logged them in a folder, and named the folder Lockstep. Open items. Old habit. Open items eventually get closed. I took what I had to a litigation attorney that August. She was kind, which somehow made it worse. Forgery and fraud, she said, are real claims, but claims need evidence you can authenticate. Photocopies forwarded by clients wouldn't be enough. I'd need the original letters, the master files, the internal emails showing who ordered what. All of that lived on Lockstep's servers and in Lockstep's file room, and I no longer had any legal right to walk through that door. Dale Mercer, the one man who might have known where the bodies were filed, had been let go the week of the takeover and moved to Florida to be near his grandkids. A lawsuit meant 6 figures I didn't have, 2 years I couldn't spare, and a courtroom in a county where my father had sponsored the youth baseball league for 2 decades. You'd be suing your dad in his own town, she said, on photocopies. I understood the math. I'd like to tell you I raged against it, but you've probably lived some version of this yourself, and you know the shape of it. Some doors don't slam, they just click. Around town, the story had already set like concrete. Poor Frank Hayes, bailing out his flighty daughter's company, and her repaying him by dumping her clients on her sister and skipping town. My mother heard that version at church every Sunday. She never once corrected it. We don't discuss family business, she told my Aunt Ruth, in the voice she used for settled matters. My account balance that October was $3,200. I bought a one-way ticket to Denver, packed 2 suitcases, and took exactly one thing from the wreckage of Lockstep. The whiteboard from my old garage office, the one with my first network diagram still ghosted into the surface. Denver didn't care whose daughter I was, which made it the most honest place I'd ever lived. I rented a studio apartment next to the freight tracks, close enough that the freight train at 2 in the morning became my alarm for finishing incident reports. For 2 years I worked contract incident response, the graveyard shifts nobody wanted, hospitals and credit unions calling at midnight with their systems on fire. It turns out that being methodically, obsessively documented is a superpower in a crisis. Clients started asking for me by name. In 2018, with 2 engineers who trusted me more than I trusted anyone, I founded Kestrel Ridge Security. A kestrel is a small falcon that hovers dead still in high wind before it strikes. I didn't pick the name by accident. I built the company the way a burned patient builds a house, every wire inspected twice. I took no money from anyone I loved. I read every term sheet 3 times, and then paid 2 different lawyers to read it behind me. When investors pushed for control provisions, I walked away from term sheets. My own board thought I was crazy to refuse. One of my engineers joked that I ran the company like everyone was already breaching us. He wasn't wrong. 10 years in this industry taught me that every disaster begins with somebody extending trust on autopilot, and I had made my last autopilot deal at 23. In the back of every one of those decisions sat a folder that moved with me from laptop to laptop, never deleted, never opened more than once a year. Lockstep. Open items. I wasn't building a lawsuit. The lawyer had cured me of that fantasy. I honestly couldn't have told you what I was keeping it for. In my experience, you log first and understand later. Kestrel Ridge grew the way trust grows, slowly and then suddenly. We landed a state government contract in 2019, our Series A in 2020, a Series C in 2024 that put us in the national trade press. Somewhere in there, a Dayton Business Journal ran a local girl makes good piece, and my mother mailed me the clipping with a post-it that said, "We always knew you had it in you." I sat with that note for a long time. We always knew. The same people who had repriced me to 0 were now claiming founders' shares in my comeback. My dad never called. Not when we hit 100 employees, not when I gave a keynote in Las Vegas that ended up on YouTube. I learned about the family's fortunes sideways, through my Aunt Ruth's phone calls, which were short, dry, and more honest than every Christmas card my mother ever sent combined. Hayes Office Systems was shrinking because the print business was dying everywhere, and Boland Hayes Group, the agency built on my 40 clients, was slowly starving. It turns out clients acquired by letter can be lost the same way. The school district left, then the hospital network, then in 2023 the anchor client whose retainer paid Meredith's payroll. My sister had renamed the firm Boland Group, dropped the Hayes, taken bank loans to cover payroll, and by 2025 the whole thing was leaning like a shed in the wind. I want to be honest with you about what I felt hearing that, because this channel is about telling the truth quietly. I felt no joy. Those were my clients once, and my old employees were still in that building, 12 of them, people I had hired and trained and lost custody of. If you've ever watched somebody mismanage the thing that used to be yours, a house, a business, a mother's recipe, you know that particular ache. And if you know it, tell me about it in the comments, because I read them, and I know I'm not the only one who's carried this. Then, in October of 2025, my attorney Priya Anand called me with a sentence that changed the weather. Your sister's company just showed up on a distressed asset list. Priya laid it out like a weather report. The bank was calling Boland Group's loans. A liquidation was on the table within the quarter. Assets sold. Leases broken. Staff scattered. She expected me to say something about my sister. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered to me. Priya, in a liquidation, what happens to the company's records? There was a pause while she recalibrated. Retained for the legally required period, she said, then destroyed under the document retention policy. Shredded. Wiped. Gone. I closed my eyes and saw a file room I had never visited, in a building I had never entered, holding the only original copies of 40 letters I never signed, plus the old Lockstep email server that Boland had absorbed in 2016, along with everything else. The proof of what my family did to me was sitting in my sister's failing company, and it was about to be fed into a shredder by a bank that had no idea what it had. There are moments when 10 years of vague, patient waiting collapses into a single decision that takes 4 seconds. I want to buy it, I said. Not the letters, the company. Priya, to her permanent credit, asked exactly one question. As Kestrel Ridge? No. As Quarry Creek Holdings, a private vehicle with my money and none of my name on the surface, buying distressed assets from a motivated bank. It's common, it's legal, and it's anonymous. By November, the deal closed. Quarry Creek acquired 70% of Boland Group for $1.6 million, plus a $400,000 bridge loan to stabilize payroll. 34 jobs, including 12 people I once hired myself. Meredith kept her 30% and her title and had no idea who owned the other end of her lifeline. The document boxes arrived in Denver on a Tuesday. Ownership gave us the right to review company records, so the archive came to us on a freight pallet, 41 boxes wrapped in plastic. I told my team I'd handle the review of the legacy files personally, which raised no eyebrows because I always handle things personally. It was a Saturday. The office was empty. I found it in the second hour, third row, a gray banker's box with a printed label reading Client Transitions, 2016. I stood there looking at it for a while before I touched it. Then I did what I do at every incident scene. I put on nitrile gloves, I set up a camera, and I photographed the box from every angle before opening it, because chain of custody is a religion, and I am devout. On the inside of the lid, someone had stuck a yellow post-it note, the adhesive gone brittle with age, 9 years old and still legible. Use the March signature page, FH. I know my father's handwriting the way you know a voice through a wall, the left-leaning slant, the hard cross on the H. This was the hand that signed my report cards and my birthday checks, instructing someone to take a page with my name on it and put it to work. Under that post-it lay the originals. All 40 letters, crisp, never creased, each one carrying the same scanned signature. My signature, tilted a fraction of a degree off true on every single copy, the same digital ghost stamped 40 times. I photographed each letter front and back. My hands were steady, which surprised me. And then, at the bottom of the box, beneath the letters, I found something the label hadn't promised. A rubber-banded stack of spare envelopes, pre-addressed and never mailed. The handwriting on them was not my father's. I had known that handwriting since before I could read it. Neat, looping, patient. The hand that addressed 200 Christmas cards every December, that wrote "So proud of you" in my high school graduation card, that labeled the freezer meals when I had my tonsils out. My mother had addressed the envelopes. Not one or two, helping out at the kitchen table without asking questions. There were spares. You make spares when you're doing a mailing carefully, when you plan for mistakes, when you intend for every single one to arrive. For 10 years, I had told myself a survivable story. Dad did this, and Mom just failed to stop it, the way she failed to stop him from anything. That story died on a Saturday afternoon in an empty office in Denver, wearing gloves, holding proof that my mother had personally licked the stamps on my execution. "It was never yours, sweetheart." His sentence, but her postage? The old lockstep email server gave up the rest. In a backup folder, I found a message from my dad's account to the office manager's queue, short and unbothered. "Use the March signature page. Stella will understand someday." I sat with that word, someday, for a long time. Then I called Dale Mercer in Florida. He's in his 70s now. When I told him what I was holding, he was quiet. And then this Air Force records clerk who never once broke alphabetical order started to cry on the phone. He'd forwarded himself that email in 2016, he said, the day before they walked him out. Because it didn't smell right, and somebody ought to keep a copy of things. He sent a sworn affidavit that week, voluntarily, notarized. So now I had everything. Every original, every email, a witness. The only question left was the one no evidence can answer. What was it all for? I'll tell you the part I'm not proud of, because you deserve the whole ledger. One night in December, alone with a glass of wine I didn't drink, I opened a blank memo and let the coldest version of myself type. It came out fluent. Terminate the managing director. Call the $400,000 bridge loan. Wind the company down. Sell the client book. Let the bank pick the bones. And mail my parents a copy of the forgery file with no note, postmarked Denver. Total elapsed time, maybe 90 days. Total cost to me, nothing. I read that memo twice, and the second time through, I heard it. The voice. Nothing personal. Paper is paper. The note holder elects conversion. I had written my father's greatest hits in my own font. That's the trap nobody warns you about when your family runs on a ledger. The ledger doesn't care which side of it you're standing on. It just wants to keep being the language everyone speaks, and I had spoken it fluently on the first try. Somewhere in me, his arithmetic was installed and running, and revenge would just be me doing his bookkeeping with better software. I deleted the memo. I'd like to say it felt noble. Mostly it felt like pulling a fishhook out of my own palm, slow and backwards, and necessary. But deleting a plan is not the same as having one. I knew what I wasn't willing to do. I had no idea yet what I was going to do, and the boxes sat in my office like an unexploded thing. It was Priya who finally put her finger on the fork in the road. We were reviewing the acquisition one evening when she looked at me over her glasses and asked, "Stella, do you want justice, or do you want a verdict? Because the verdict window closed a long time ago." She walked me through it the way I walk clients through a breach they can't undo. Under Ohio law, a civil fraud claim generally has to be brought within 4 years, and mine ran from 2016. There's a discovery rule argument, she said, when the victim couldn't reasonably have known. But I had seen photocopies of those letters within weeks of the takeover, which meant a defense lawyer would argue my clock started ticking a decade ago, and he'd probably win. Criminal forgery charges were theoretically possible and practically fiction. No county prosecutor was reopening a 10-year-old family paper dispute involving the man who sponsored youth baseball for 20 years, especially with the statute of limitations questions stacked on top. I can have a specialist double-check the timing math, Priya said, but I don't want you to spend hope on it. I didn't. I've read enough post-incident reports to know when a system can't be restored. So there it was, the fact I had to swallow whole. I now possessed complete, beautiful, forensic proof of exactly what was done to me, and no courtroom on earth would ever weigh it. The evidence had one power left, and only one. It could make the truth stand up straight in front of the specific people who had spent 10 years believing the lie. Not the public. Not a jury. The jury that mattered had always been smaller than that, and I could see them if I closed my eyes, passing the potatoes. My father's version of me had been tried and convicted at that dinner table on Marlowe Street, in front of the whole family, with my mother seconding the motion. If there was a courtroom left anywhere with jurisdiction over my case, it had a pot roast in the middle of it. Then what do you actually want? Priya asked me, the week we closed the books on the acquisition. Because I can't draft toward a feeling. I looked out at the mountains and heard myself say it before I'd fully thought it. I don't want it back. I want it true. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, then decide what you're willing to pay for true. It's rarely free. That question turned out to be a load-bearing wall, because as soon as I imagined the truth landing, actually landing, on that table, in front of those faces, I could also see the shrapnel pattern, and standing directly in it were 34 people who had done nothing to me. The employees of Boland Group had not forged anything. 12 of them were my own people from the lockstep days, folks who'd stayed because Dayton was home, and a paycheck is a paycheck. If the truth detonated and took the company with it, my father would lose face and they would lose mortgages. That math offended me. So I gave Priya a second assignment, one that confused her more than the first. I asked her to research employee ownership trusts, the mechanics of converting a private company so that its workers hold the equity, how fast the documents could be drafted, and how clean it could be done for a firm of that size. You just bought this company, she said carefully, and you're asking me how to give it away. I told her to draft it anyway and keep it in a drawer, and I couldn't fully explain why, not even to myself, not yet. 2 weeks later, the trade press started whispering that Kestrel Ridge was about to close its Series D. Headlines were coming. And headlines travel to Ohio fast. The Series D closed in March of 2026. $128 million raised at a valuation of $940 million, and my face on the front page of the financial press under the word empire, which made me laugh. Because empires are inherited, and I had built mine out of a studio apartment with a train for an alarm clock. My phone became a slot machine. High school classmates I hadn't heard from in 15 years. The Dayton Chamber of Commerce, warmly inviting me to keynote their annual dinner, no mention of the years their members had traded stories about how I'd abandoned my clients. I answered politely and committed to nothing. And from the White House on Marlowe Street, silence. 1 day, then 3, then 5. I told Priya it would take 7 days. I had guessed short. My father has never in his life allowed himself to look hungry, and hunger takes time to dress up as an invitation. It took 9 days. On the 10th morning, a Tuesday, my phone buzzed while the headline was still taped to the conference room glass, and there it was. Under the contact photo, my mother hasn't changed since 2014. Family dinner. No excuses. Which brings us back to where I started this story. Except now you know what I knew. Standing in that conference room with champagne, I wasn't drinking. You know about the gray box in my office labeled Client Transitions, 2016. You know about the post-it in my father's hand, the envelopes in my mother's, the affidavit from Florida, and the ownership papers sleeping in Priya's drawer. My family was inviting me to dinner because a number with 9 zeros had made me family again. They thought they were setting the table. So was I. My Aunt Ruth called me 2 nights later on her own phone, from her car, which is where honest conversations in my family have always lived. Ruth is my father's older sister, 71, a retired school principal with a voice like a wood rasp. She has exactly one loyalty, which is to the truth, and it has cost her exactly what you'd expect. "It's not a dinner," she said, skipping hello. "It's a board meeting with a ham. Frank's been telling the cousins for a week that the family businesses are coming back together. Meredith's been ordered to bring a presentation. A presentation, Stella. On poster board or God knows what." I asked what he wanted from me, though I already knew the shape of it. "Money, honey. The bank's been circling Boland Group since fall. He's going to stand up with his glass and talk about family, and then he's going to ask you to buy your sister's company. Keep the money where it belongs." I almost laughed. My father was about to formally request that I purchase a company I had owned since November. The dramatic irony was so thick you could have served it with the ham. Then Ruth's voice changed, went quieter and older. "You know he's not inventing this playbook. Your grandfather ran this exact dinner on me in 1987, when I wanted to sell my share of the hardware stores and go finish my degree. Different table, same menu. I was the selfish one who wouldn't help family. Nobody at that table asked what he'd taken from me first." She let that sit. "Whatever you're planning, and I can hear that you're planning, don't go into that house alone the way I did." I told her I wouldn't be alone. I'd be bringing witnesses. 40 of them. In a gray box. The night before I flew out, I laid 2 cases open on my dining room table like surgical trays. Into the first went the evidence. 40 original letters in archival sleeves, the post-it photographed and preserved, the server email printed and certified, Dale's notarized affidavit, the corporate filings for Quarry Creek. Everything a person would need to end Frank Hayes as a respected man inside his own family in under 10 minutes. Into the second case went a much stranger set of papers, the ones Priya had drafted and quietly perfected over 3 months. The Employee Ownership Trust, executable the moment I signed, plus one more document with my niece Lily's name on it. And standing over those 2 open cases at midnight, I finally had to run the diagnostic I'd been avoiding all year. Why was I really going? Because here's the truth I found when I checked my own logs. Every milestone of the last 10 years, every funding round, every headline, every 100 new employees, some part of me had presented to an auditor who wasn't in the room. Front row, aisle seat, my father, forever reviewing my numbers over a pot roast. I had built a $940 million company, at least partly, as an exhibit. Exhibit A in a trial that was never going to be held, before a judge who had already ruled, in a courtroom that only existed inside me. That's what nobody tells you about being written out of the will of your family's respect. You can spend your whole life appealing a verdict nobody's ever going to overturn, and call it ambition. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever caught yourself achieving at somebody, succeeding at them, waiting for a scoreboard in their face to finally say you were right, I want you to tell me in the comments, because I promise you the auditor in your front row isn't worth the seat. It took me 10 years and 2 open briefcases to see mine clearly. I closed both cases. Then I picked up my phone, opened my mother's text, that summons with no question mark in it, and typed back the only reply it deserved. "I'll be there." In the morning, I called Priya and crossed the line I couldn't uncross. "Finalize the trust," I said. "All of it. And Priya, bring me the version I can sign at a dinner table." There was a long pause on her end, the kind lawyers take when they're deciding whether to talk you out of something. "You're really going to do it in front of them?" she said. Not a question. I told her that 10 years ago my company had been taken from me at a table in front of my family. 20 minutes. All very procedural. Pass the potatoes. Whatever I did next was going to happen at the same altitude. She didn't argue. By Thursday, the documents were ready. My 70% of Boland Group, transferring in full to an employee ownership trust benefiting all 34 employees, with the bridge loan forgiven at signing. And separately, in a plain envelope, a college trust for Lily, my sister's 9-year-old, funded with $250,000 and administered by an independent trustee in Columbus, a woman none of us had ever met, chosen precisely because no one at that dinner table could ever charm, bully, or borrow against her. If you've followed this channel a while, You know I believe the most important sentence in any trust document is the one that says, "Who can't touch it?" I booked the flight for Friday. Window seat, over the wing, the same cheap instinct I had when I flew out of Dayton with $3,200 to my name. Somewhere over Kansas, I realized I wasn't nervous, and the absence felt strange, like a missing tooth. I had spent 10 years rehearsing arguments for people who never granted the hearing. Now the hearing was granted, and I had stopped needing to argue. The plane landed in Dayton in April rain. I checked into a hotel downtown because there was no version of this where I slept in my childhood bedroom under a quilt my mother made. Saturday afternoon, with hours to burn, I drove the rental through my old life. The Lockstep office on Wayne Avenue is a dental clinic now. The sign advertises free whitening consultations, which I chose to find funny. Then, without quite deciding to, I drove past the Boland Group building and parked across the street in the rain. Second floor, lights on even on a Saturday. Through the tall front windows I could see stations of desks, a sad rubber plant, and then a figure moving between them, and my chest did something complicated. Meredith, my sister, 40 now, standing beside a young employee's monitor, walking her through something with the flat patience of a person who has explained the same thing many times. She looked thin. She looked, honestly, like someone who hadn't slept properly in a fiscal year. 34 paychecks ride on that building, and whatever else my sister is, she had stayed in it while it sank instead of jumping. I sat in the car with the wipers off, letting the windshield blur, and I made myself say the complicated thing out loud, alone, so it wouldn't ambush me at the table. She took my clients. She also never forged my name. The post-it wasn't her hand. She underlined a legal pad while our father cut me out, and she was 30 and terrified of him. And none of that is innocence, and all of it is context. I drove back to the hotel. On the nightstand, my phone buzzed one more time. My mother again. 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. Wear something nice. Everyone's coming. Everyone. My father had gone ahead and impaneled the jury for me. I arrived at the house on Marlowe Street 20 minutes early, on purpose, the way I show up early to every negotiation. But I didn't ring the bell. Through the front window, past my mother's lace curtains, I could see into the living room, and what I saw there kept my finger off the button. My father was alone. He was standing at the sideboard where the family photographs live, and he had taken down the framed portrait of his own father. My grandfather Hayes, the hardware store patriarch, dead 20 years and still the largest presence in any room of that house. Dad was wiping the glass with his handkerchief, slowly, the way you polish something you're afraid of. His mouth was moving. I couldn't hear it, but I've read lips across enough conference tables to catch the shape of it. I kept it together, Pop. Something. Kept it all together. His shoulders weren't the shoulders I remembered. He looked like a man who had been carrying a piano upstairs for 50 years, alone, forbidden to set it down or admit it was heavy, and I stood in the rain and watched my father rehearse for his own father the way I had spent a decade rehearsing for mine. The chain went back further than my grievance. It always does. I want to be careful here, because understanding is a solvent, and if you pour enough of it, it dissolves things that ought to stay solid. So I'll say it the way I said it to myself on that porch. I see what was done to him. It changes nothing about what he did with it. Understanding is not a pardon. Then I rang the bell, and my mother opened the door with her church smile at full wattage and said, "There's my girl." Even the welcome had a deed attached. The dining room was dressed for a state occasion. The wedding china, the water goblets, the tablecloth that only surfaces for funerals and Easter. 9 place settings. My father at the head, my mother at his right, Meredith and Doug, Lily between them with her library book smuggled onto her lap, Aunt Ruth, my cousins Gary and Beth from the Springfield side, an empty chair for me at the foot of the table, directly opposite my father, which I noted the way you note a rifle over a fireplace, and in the center of everything, on the good platter, a pot roast. The same dish that was cooling on this same table 10 years ago while a shareholder meeting across town voted me out of my own life. My mother does not believe in coincidence. She believes in menus. Dinner opened with small talk conducted like a soft interrogation. My father, carving, observed that, "The market's been kind to you," a sentence engineered to make $940 million sound like weather that had happened to me. Gary asked if I knew any real hackers. Lily, who is 9 and the only person at that table with clean hands, looked up from her lap and asked if I had ever caught a bad guy, and I said yes, sweetheart. A few. And felt the envelope with her name on it sitting in my case like a warm coal. Meredith said almost nothing. She moved food around her plate and did not look at me, and her wine glass emptied faster than anyone's, and I recognized the posture of a person waiting for a scheduled disaster. She knew what was coming. She'd been ordered to bring a presentation. Then my father set down the carving knife, tapped his water glass with one knuckle, and stood. "While we're all together," he said, "I want to talk about family and business." He spoke for 6 minutes, and I'll give him this. It was a good speech. He talked about hard seasons and how the Hayes name had weathered them for 3 generations. He talked about loyalty like it was a crop the family had always grown. He said the word "we" 14 different ways while meaning me in every one of them. Then he arrived at the ask, and the room leaned in with him. Boland Group, he said, was a fine company going through a rough patch, undervalued, full of good people. And here was Stella, blessed by the market, in a position to do what family does: bring the businesses together, fold Boland Group in under her umbrella, put real capital behind her sister, keep the money where it belongs. Where it belongs, he repeated, and looked at me with the warm, reasonable eyes of a man who has never once audited himself. My mother touched her necklace and added, "It's what families do." Meredith stared at her plate like it owed her money. Under the table, Doug's knee bounced. I let the silence sit for a moment, and I studied my father standing there with his glass raised half high, and what I felt was not rage. It was recognition. This was the same voice that said nothing personal, paper is paper. The ledger had simply been rebalanced by a $940 million entry on my side, and now the ledger wanted its money moved home. 10 years, and the arithmetic had never blinked. I set down my fork, folded my napkin, and asked the question I had flown 1,200 miles to ask at exactly this moment. Before I answer, Dad, one thing. I turned to my sister. Meredith, who owns your company right now? The color left my sister's face in a way I have only otherwise seen in emergency rooms. What? She said. I asked again, gently, because gentleness was the only weapon I had promised myself I would use. Your company. Who owns it? You kept 30%. Who holds the rest? She looked at Dad, got nothing, and answered like a witness. A holding company bought us out of the bank workout in November. Quarry Creek. Some investment group out of Colorado, we've never even met them. It's all through lawyers. She stopped. I watched the word Colorado catch up with her. I reached into my first case and laid a thin document on the tablecloth, turned to face her. The Quarry Creek Holdings formation filings, and the signature page of the acquisition, and my name, my real, wet ink signature. Above the title, Sole Member. I'm Quarry Creek, I said. I bought Boland Group 5 months ago. I own 70% of it, and the $400,000 keeping your payroll alive is my bridge loan. The table went so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock in the hall reconsidering. Doug made a sound like a hiccup. Ruth put down her fork with the deliberate calm of a woman securing a front row seat. And my father, I want you to see this the way I saw it. My father was stunned for exactly 3 seconds, and then his face did something extraordinary. It bloomed. He laughed, warm and huge, and spread both arms like a preacher at a baptism. "Well, there it is," he boomed. "It's already in the family. Stella, honey, you beat me to it." He raised his glass to the table. He genuinely, sincerely thought this was the good news. That's when I understood there was no bottom to reach by talking. So I stopped talking, and I lifted the gray box onto the table. "There's one more thing that came with the company, Dad." I set it beside the pot roast, label facing him. Client Transitions, 2016, The room read it together. I opened the lid and began laying the contents down the center of the table like place cards, the 40 original letters, fanned in their sleeves. Every client I ever had, informed in writing that I was abandoning them, signed by me. Except I never signed one of these in my life. That's a scan of my signature from an insurance amendment printed 40 times. Same ghost, same tilt, on every page. I set down the photograph of the post-it, enlarged, his handwriting filling the frame. Use the March signature page. FH. Your instruction. I set down the server email, certified. Your words. Stella will understand someday. I set down Dale Mercer's affidavit. Your office manager. He kept a copy because he thought somebody should. My cousins were passing the letters with their mouths open. Ruth read the post-it and nodded once, slowly, like a judge who has waited 39 years for the right case. And then I took out the rubber-banded stack of unmailed envelopes, and I didn't say anything at all. I just walked down the table and set them in front of my mother and let her look at her own handwriting. Her hand came up to her mouth. The room followed her eyes, and one by one, they understood what they were seeing. My father's voice arrived then, and for the first time in my life it cracked in public. Denial first. That's out of context. Then justification. I was protecting this family. And finally, both palms flat on the table. The truth in its Sunday clothes. You don't understand what I was carrying. I waited until he was finished. I'm not here for the company, Dad, I said, level as a spirit gauge. I don't want it back. I want it true. Fine, my father said, and his voice had gravel in it now, the ledger scrambling for a page that still balanced. Fine, you own it. Congratulations. Take the company. That's what you came for, isn't it? Call the loan. Do it. Show everyone what you flew here to do. And every face at that table turned to me, and I saw it in each of them, the certainty that they knew what came next, because they had all grown up in the same arithmetic. Now the strong one squeezes. Instead, I opened the second case. This is what I flew here to do. Priya's documents came out bound and tabbed. I uncapped my pen, and right there on my mother's funeral and Easter tablecloth, I signed my 70% of Boland Group into an employee ownership trust. Every share transferred to the 34 people who actually work there, including the 12 I hired myself a lifetime ago. I signed the forgiveness of the $400,000 bridge loan. I slid the packet down the table to Meredith. The company belongs to your people now. The trust board decides who manages it. If they keep you, you'll be the first Hayes in 3 generations to hold a job because somebody chose you. She didn't wipe her eyes. She just looked at me the way you look at weather that changed too fast to dress for. Then I set the last envelope in front of Lily. For your college, sweetheart. It's yours, in a trust. There's a woman in Columbus who guards it, and no adult at this table can touch it. Not one. I looked up at my father, still standing, hands still flat on the wood, and I gave him back his own sentence, the one I had carried for 10 years like shrapnel too deep to cut out. You were right, Dad. That one was never mine. This one is. And I thanked my mother for dinner, and I stood up. I made it to the front door before I heard her chair scrape back. My mother followed me out onto the porch, into the small April rain, and I turned, because some part of me, even then, was still 8 years old and hoping. She stood under the porch light with her arms crossed against the cold, and my mother looked at me, at her daughter, holding a case full of proof of what had been done to her. And she said, "Why couldn't you just let us have this? We're your family." Not "I'm sorry." Not "I should have told you." Even now, with her own handwriting sitting on the tablecloth behind her, the story she reached for was the one where I had taken something from them. The ledger was the only language left in that house, and in the ledger's grammar, the truth itself was an asset I had selfishly refused to write off. I looked at her for a long moment. The lace curtains glowed behind her, and somewhere inside, Lily's voice was asking what an affidavit was. "I paid for the truth, Mom," I said. "The letters, the company, all of it. I bought it back with my own money. You just watched me carry it. Twice. She opened her mouth, and I will never know what she was going to say, because Meredith appeared in the doorway behind her, pale, holding the trust packet against her chest like a life vest, and my sister's lips moved around something that had waited 10 years. The letters. I knew about and no sound came out. I nodded at her once, so she'd know the sentence was received anyway. Then I walked down the steps my father had poured the summer I was born, got in the rental car, and drove back to the hotel through the wet streets of a town that used to know me wrong. I sat by the hotel window for a long time that night, watching Dayton shine wet and orange under the streetlights, and I waited to feel the thing I had assumed would come: triumph, or grief, or the urge to call someone and narrate it. None of it came. What came instead was quiet, an enormous, unfamiliar quiet, like a server room after you finally locate the failing fan. Around 11, my phone lit up. Ruth. 1987 finally lost one, it said. And then, a minute later, your grandmother would have liked you. The family group chat, the one I had been silently reading for years without posting, said nothing at all. No eruption, no defense of Dad, no version control war over what had happened at that table. Silence, which in my family is not peace, just inventory. I opened the chat settings and left the group. I didn't block anyone. I just stopped holding a seat in a room where my name had always been a line item. And sitting there, I finally audited the 10 years honestly. I hadn't built Kestrel Ridge in spite of that dinner table. I had built a great deal of it for that dinner table, brick by brick, an appeal filed year after year to a court that was never in session. Tonight, I had walked into the courtroom, presented the whole case, won it on the merits in front of the only jury with jurisdiction, and discovered, in the same breath, that I no longer needed the verdict. The auditor's chair in my front row was finally empty. My mother's text had said no excuses, and she was right. Though not the way she meant it. I was done making excuses for them. I flew home to Denver on the morning flight, and I slept the whole way, which hadn't happened in 10 years. 3 months out, here's what the fallout actually looks like, because I promised you measurable truth, not fireworks. The employee trust runs Boland Group now. The workers voted to rename it Right Line Services, after the river and the brothers, and nobody consulted a Hayes about it, which I consider the healthiest sentence in this story. The trust board met in June and kept Meredith on as general manager, on merit, with a 1-year review, which means my sister, at 40, is the first person in our family to hold her job purely because the people she leads chose to keep her. She sent me a letter in July. Handwritten. 1 page. It said she had known about the letters since 2016, that she'd told herself it was Dad's call to make, and that she was sorry, without one softening clause around the word. I wrote back a single line. Run it well. And I meant it completely. That's not a reconciliation, it's a beginning of accurate accounting, and in my family, accurate accounting is intimacy. My father tells a different story at the golf course, Ruth reports. In his version, he took a hard decision in 2016 that saved jobs, and I repaid the family with a stunt at dinner. He'll tell it that way until he dies, and the men he golfs with will nod, and none of them will ask why his daughter gave a company away rather than hand him $1. I've stopped needing them to ask. My mother sends cards. Same loops. Same postage, as if the envelope in front of her at that table belongs to some other woman's handwriting. I don't open them yet. I put them in a shoebox, unread, because a boundary doesn't have to be a bonfire. Lily's fund sits in Columbus, growing quietly, guarded by a trustee who has already once, I'm told, declined a phone call from my father, which cost her nothing because she owes him nothing, which is the whole design. And at Kestrel Ridge, on the first Thursday of every month now, I teach a free evening class for women founders. Lesson 1 never changes. We read a convertible note together, clause by clause, and I show them, on the whiteboard from my old garage. It hangs in our lobby, first thing you see, exactly where love signs its name. People ask sometimes, carefully, whether I regret the money, the price of the company, the forgiven loan, the fund, all of it spent to buy back a truth the courts had already orphaned. I tell them what I finally know for certain. Everything they were able to take from me was never the valuable part, because the only asset that can't be seized, converted, or signed away by somebody else's hand is the proven ability to start from nothing and build it true. That's my story. One yellow post-it. 40 letters I never signed, and one signature I chose to give away. If this reminded you to read every clause before you take money from someone you love, or to stop auditing your own worth on somebody else's ledger, take it as your sign and do it this week, not someday. Share this video with someone who's still carrying a verdict that was never true. Drop a comment and tell me your story. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.